Hello, everyone. Hey, Destiny. It's really good to see your face.
Likewise, Lee, how are you?
I am doing all right. Um, yeah, it's good to see you. You had last week off, and
I know.
how
Last
was
two
that?
weeks, I feel like I think it's
Yeah,
been a while. But my fill-in Gail, she did wonderful. So that was good. And from what I got to see, you had a wonderful episode and a very timely and important one. So happy that the show went on without me. But I appreciated the break. And also, we're matching today. If y'all
I
haven't
know.
noticed.
We have our hoodies on with our white drawstrings. um, yeah, and this week we have a another timely episode that we should all be lifting up and talking about, and that is raising awareness for the hate that is being experienced by our Asian American, and Pacific Islander community. And we'll use during this episode AAPI, but that is what that stands for. And we have amazing guests that are going to be joining us tonight to discuss that and how we can be proactive and how we can get involved in this work alongside our AAPI siblings. And so we're really excited about that. And we also, before we start, I want us to point us to some future episodes that are going to be coming up. Next week, we're going to be talking about a new book that was called Race in America. And so we're going to have some of the writers from that. We're going to be talking about immigration and the border. And closing out the month of April, we're going to be talking about how we can end gun violence. And so everyone should put those on your calendar and make sure you tune in for us then. But now we are going to welcome our
Well,
guest.
Lee, I think before we welcome our guests, you forgot to mention an important thing that's
Oh,
coming up
what?
tomorrow.
Oh, yes,
Our
that is
yearly
correct.
anniversary of doing Just Talk Live.
I know we're celebrating a year doing this, which is, I mean, and we've done how many episodes? Probably almost 60 or 70,
Too
I'm going to
many.
say. Yeah. And yeah, so we are going to be celebrating a year doing this show and bringing y'all amazing guests and uplifting a lot of the things that so many people have been doing in the world and in the church. So we're very grateful for your support out there, and we may go live tomorrow. Who knows? To celebrate.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. But with that, we are going to bring on our guests. And so we are going to be welcoming Samuel Sun and Hailey Pine M and Ray Huang to the show. So welcome, everyone.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for coming on and giving us your time. And Lee and I greatly appreciate it, especially as we're celebrating our 1 year anniversary. I probably won't keep just mentioning that throughout the show. Just showcase.
Congratulations.
Of course, the interruption of the kid. Okay, he made his cameo. You planned that.
That's the beauty of being live,
There's the other guest too.
So we'll just ask you to, introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about you, the background and perspective that you'll be sharing, and anything else that you think might be relevant for this conversation today. And we're going to start with Rev Ray and work our way around the screen.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's an honor to chat with you all about such an important topic. So some background on me, and I'm starting a little earlier than I normally would in conversations like this, because I think my background might be interesting actually in this conversation, which is that I grew up in a Chinese immigrant family here I was born in Connecticut, but was raised in New Jersey and then Massachusetts, and grew up specifically in a Chinese immigrant church. That was my main community. That was my family. My parents were here and my brother, and then that was about it. So all our extended family were in Taiwan, which is where my family is from. My family is also part Japanese as well. And the Chinese church was my upbringing. It was not a Presbyterian church. It was a non-denominational, if you would think theologically, it's more like a Baptist Presbyterian theology church. And then I found the PCUSA when I was studying in undergrad at Boston College, studying theology, and started working at Fourth Presbyterian Church in Boston. Go Fourth Church, and I just fell in love with that community and had felt called into ministry. But my own church did not ordain women in my Chinese immigrant church, and so I decided to continue on to seminary, still unsure whether or not I could be ordained, because I felt like I had grown up thinking women could not be ordained in the Chinese church, and then eventually decided to start the ordination process after I finished seminary at Boston University School of Theology. And so that's how I entered the PCUSA. So fast forward, now I am an ordained teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church, and also a community organizer here in Los Angeles. Is there anything else that you'd like me to share there? As I'll pass it on.
Yep.
Hey, Ben, do you want to?
Sure. Okay. I guess we're all
we're spirit led. Go with the flow. When the first person stops, just hop right on in there.
Okay, sounds good. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Actually, again, my name is Hailey Pine. I lead a nonprofit called Faith and Community Empowerment. And I guess was like Rev Ray. I grew up actually in a Southern Baptist context. And when God called me to ministry, the elder of the Caucasian congregation in the same space, who really loved our family, said, "Hey, Pin," and he had total serious look, but smiling, said, "Don't expect us to invite you to the pulpit, when you're done." And he's smiling, very nice, but very straightforward, right? And I think, again, I didn't think women were allowed to be ordained as well. So anyway, God took me on this journey. Long story short, I answered God's call to ministry, and I didn't want to, but my mom's story was the story of Jonah, where God calls you, you run away, you go through hell, you end up being the same place anyway. So I remember telling God, if you ever call me, make it really clear and I will obey. And sure enough, in 2000, God made it really clear. I obeyed reluctantly, resentfully, but obediently. And in an amazing way, God opened these doors that I never imagined, and took me all the way into, even a visit with President Obama and Biden in the Oval Office, and being a presidential appointee as well. I run a nonprofit called Faith and Community Empowerment, and came out of my parents' journey of being in ministry, and they thought they were going to preach the gospel, save the souls. They did all that kind of work, but they also ended up becoming unpaid social workers, because so much, there was so much need in the congregation for assistance with jobs, housing, you name it. And, the other day I had the privilege to be at a press conference with Vice President Kamala Harris. And I was one of the 5 invited speakers, and I represented the voice for faith organizations. At the end of the day, there's over almost 400,000 houses of worship, and we all serve as first responders. Right? I mean, we're free, accessible. Not sure if we're experts, but, for all those reasons, they come to us, but yet we're not equipped with either the skill set or the relationships. And so, long story short, I always thought there could be a better way. I grew up, I saw this model at First AAPI Church, a very prominent African-American church in LA, where they did the same work my parents were doing, but because they partnered with the broader community through their affiliated nonprofit, they could tap into those outside resources and really help people at a whole different scale. But I think this is where it's most relevant in our conversation today, which is that as a Korean American coming out of the LA riots, I saw our community kicked down and crying. Out of the $1 billion in damage, over 40% were incurred by Koreans, over 2,000 businesses destroyed in our community. And yet when we were kicked down and crying, my question was, why weren't there others to cry with us? And I saw this model of mutuality through partnerships. Suddenly, where there was government entities, corporations, they had a vested interest, a stake in the church's success. So they were lauding the work of the church in rooms and places where usually God's not mentioned, churches are not mentioned, or communities of color are not mentioned. And so suddenly the church's reputation grew, their welcome grew, and they were now perceived as a valued stakeholder and invited to the decision-making table. And so for me, in terms of our conversation today, part of it is, how do we create a seat at the table to be invited to the decision-making table? How to create a society where there's mutuality, right? Where we have a stake in each other's success, safety, right? And achieving our full potential as well.
All right. So Samuel's son, and occasionally you might hear the music of my family. It's evening hour here, and I'm really excited and thankful that we get to be part of your anniversary show. Okay, that's what we're going to call this, your anniversary show. So yeah, I grew up a Korean immigrant, came here when I was 7. Anti-Asian slur. I mean, I grew up with it, right? Chink. The first home that we bought in Long Island, coming back from a Wednesday Bible study, graffitied it all over the doors, is "Go Back Home, Chink." And then, of course, the church. I grew up in the Korean church, so I only imagine myself serving in a Korean church. That is another form of racism, right? I've never been able to see myself in other communities being a leader. So I grew up in the Korean church, got ordained, serving in the Korean church. Was a church in Phoenix, will not be named, and where I just said, I'm going to give up ministry, give up church, give up faith. And I remember when I'm going to the library looking for some job. I was an English major, and there weren't many options, not paying well enough job to feed my growing family. So I said, you know what, I need to find just any church to work at during this transition time. But God was gracious. Church opened up in North Carolina. I started working there again. And guys gave me 2 years, some stable salary while I make transition. But while I was doing ministry there for Korean American young adults, non-Korean Americans started coming in. And this wasn't because we had any strategy. They just started coming in. I mean, even one Presbyterian dude was saying that he had Google Map and was going to a white Presbyterian church. But as he was driving, he felt, this is a Presbyterian, said he felt the voice of God saying, turn right. And he came in and he started joining our church. We're still good friends now. But them coming in, we realized, if you're going to be truly inclusive, it's not just the pews, but it's also even the sessions, right? You have to have voice. And so with a lot of conversation, they launched us as a new worshiping community. I was one of those 1,001 years worshiping community, and we became an intercultural congregation. And when I was reading scripture now with my congregation members, who are African American, who are white American, who are Hispanic American, the scripture came alive. I mean, Paul was wrestling with a new social reality by resurrection, which was that people who really hated us and killed each other, the Greeks and Jews, suddenly now have to break bread. How is that possible? How can we live that out, right? And working that out was his scripture and theology. And so scripture became a lived experience. This is something very relevant. And so that ministry eventually became a calling for me at the Presbyterian Mission Agency as the manager of diversity and reconciliation. And that's what I'm doing. And intercultural transformation is anti-racism work. It is really dismantling white supremacy for the sake of Christ supremacy. And secondly, it is not just for the congregation, actually. It is a way for us to show what a God-imbued society, what God intends, the shalom God intends for the world, the church is supposed to show and then lead. So it's a societal transformation work. And that excites me.
Yeah, well, welcome all of you to this, and thank you for sharing your experience and your story and your time with us. And I think a good place for us to start is to really talk about a lot of people with the shooting in Atlanta, the killing in Atlanta. It kind of brought and other forms of violence toward the AAPI community. It really has kind of brought to the surface this hate towards the AAPI community that's kind of always been there and that people are very ignorant of. And so I wonder if we can begin the conversation just basically about that. How do we really begin to understand the history, even as we're experiencing now, but to know that this has been going on for a long time. And maybe we'll start the same way we introduced, so we have an order. We Presbyterians like a little bit of order, but and then maybe the next question go around we'll reverse it. But Reverend Ray, start us off with that question.
Sure, thanks. And I'm glad you're asking this question, because I think many of us, and I think, Hailey Pine and Samuel have already named this, that folks don't actually know the history, are not aware of the history of Asian Americans in America. The history of how we got here where we are. Just before we started this evening conversation, Hailey Pine was mentioning that we are often seen as the model minority. We are, at least that's how we're labeled, right? We're seen as the ones who have succeeded. We're the success story for America. So why can't all the rest of the Americans, or specifically foreigners is what they're saying, right? Or people who don't look white, why can't they just follow along and be like the Asians? And yet the history of Asians in the US is extraordinarily complicated and problematic. From the very beginning, when Chinese immigrants started to enter into the U.S., it was largely for the gold rush, to try and make it for their families, to try and bring some, economic relief for their families and bring it back home to their country. And yet that led, because of the immediate racism and discrimination they encountered, they ended up becoming indentured servants and slaves to build railroads, right? And then were forced into small enclaves of where they could live, because they were not allowed to live in other places. They faced discrimination as they were trying to build their own, systems and their own economic success. They were not allowed into the industry. They were forced into into spaces where they were living in poverty and had to create their own ways of being able to survive. And I'm sort of passing a lot of history. But I'm just trying to touch on these pieces because it's so much. And I encourage all who are listening today to really look into the history of Asians in the US. And I'm just tapping into just the Chinese history. I could go into all the many other areas, because the AAPI covers a lot of our groups, and we often lump them into one group. But actually, we are such a diverse community. But I'll go on just so you get a sense of the history, right? And then, now we're leading into, okay, we've got Chinese who have finished building the railroads. They're trying to figure out how to survive and live in the US. So they now maybe start, restaurants, they start being laundry workers. And then you bring in the Exclusion Act, because now you have a lot of men who have arrived here and who are unable to have the wealth to bring their woman in. And so now, there's some women here and some women there. And now, so they've started, there have been a number of the passing of acts that are discriminatory. The Page Act of 1875, for example, excluded Chinese women specifically from entering into the US, saying that they were somehow, that women were not coming for the right reasons. They were bringing a sort of, if you will, I'm going to use the Christian term, sinfulness into the US. Eventually, then the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And this actually was in place up until into the 1940s with the Magnuson Act, eventually the Immigration Nationality Act in the 60s. So, this is in the history, and I'm just talking about one group, right? I'm just talking about the Chinese. If we want to now talk about, Korean Americans, if we want to talk about Japanese Americans, right? The internment camps that we had in California and elsewhere. If we want to talk, these are our more successful model minority Asians. Usually that's how we talk about us, but we're not including as well our Pacific Islander brothers and sisters and kin. We're not including our Southeast Asian brothers and sisters and kin from Cambodia and Vietnam and so forth. And the stories and the experiences of discrimination that we face. I kind of want to go into a little deeper, but I want to allow my Samuel and Hailey Pine to also share their knowledge because something I'd love to get into in this space in this hour is also talking about, yes, our history, but also what's happening now and how this history has not ended. The foundation of how we entered into the US, how we were named, how we were seen as foreigners, as the outsiders, as the ones, especially women, that, seen as the sinful sexual beings, right? I want to bring that into a conversation about how that has not changed even today. But I'd love to hear what Hailey Pine and Samuel have to say. So Hailey Pine, I'd love to hear you.
Well, thank you for doing some lifting, so I don't have to. I do want to just bring some additional examples. So particularly in the Korean community, their immigration to the U.S. were facilitated by U.S. missionaries, and that's why actually in some ways, when they came to the promised land, they realized there was no paradise or promised land. They really became indentured servants. Again, it was facilitated by two U.S. missionaries, Presbyterian and United Methodists, right? But when they came here, first of all, there were very few women, and they weren't allowed to marry anyone else, right? And so these men ultimately, dealt with either ended up in gambling and drinking because there was no other solace, or maybe they stayed with the church, but those were their options, right? And so there's that beginning to where ultimately they did have picture brides, right? And you see like 14-year-old girls who thought they were coming to the promised land with pictures of 20-year-old men and coming to America and being welcomed by 40, 50-year-old. Could you just imagine that? Who are their husbands? So there's also that history with women as well. But, for me as an Asian American, a great injustice and racism is that I don't learn about our own history in this country and our contributions. And it was only actually when I went to a KAC college leadership conference, for which eventually I became a president. But at the leadership conference, I learned about how Korean Americans of Korean descent had contributed to this country. And there was suddenly this kind of aha moment, like, wow, you know what? If my ancestors contributed to America, then I have as much right to say where this country goes. And that was kind of a shift that I think many Asian Americans do not have that privilege. And so that's another form of injustice. But some of the things that I'm learning is like the largest lynching actually happened with Chinese in California as well. I think it was like 30 individuals, right? And so I know that when I'm learning about lynching, it's largely in the African-American context. So I had no idea. And then in other times, I've heard also about the Latino community also facing lynching, especially like in the Southwest area. So again, there's a lot of these kind of bits of history. Most recently, I was reading this article about a mass shooting in Stockton, I'm sorry. And pretty much they said, oh, it's not racial, but the California Attorney General, he had to submit a report that was not largely publicized, but it says that the guy had made racist comments. And it was actually that school was largely Vietnamese and I think Southeast Asians. But somehow he said, oh, the Hindus, which is actually not they're South Asian, right? A whole different category. They're like taking over our factory and, like I want to get rid of them, something in that vein. But again, over and over, the Asian community faces racism, but maybe it may not either fit in the box of what racism tradition has been, especially in this country. I think the black-white binary framework has been the norm. And if we do not, as a community, fit in that box, then our pain, our sorrows, whatever, continue to be somehow minimized, ignored, or marginalized. And another part that I think is sensitive, but I think it's an elephant in the room that we need to also deal with. In terms of the recent hate crimes, there's also the optics of the Black on Asian crime. And particularly, I would say lately, I think it's more new of like in a visible way with, hitting the elderly or women or, things like that. But traditionally, it's been in our businesses where traditionally the store owners are not there by choice, but really because of lack of options. So they're also in kind of similar economic wheelchairs of the surrounding community. And yet, in terms of them being a victim of constant, a crime, racist assaults and attacks continue to be not acknowledged. And so again, I think that's kind of another elephant in the room that needs to be dealt with sensitivity. But I think, the best way to deal with the solution is to see the problem accurately. I always like to say, if I want someone to jump and they don't, well, I'm not going to like it. But if I see that they're in a wheelchair, something's going to shift inside of me. At minimum, I'm going to change my conversation with them. Right? I'm not going to yell and say, jump up. It's stupid and futile, right? But also suddenly my approach for my need for them to jump is going to change significantly. I may throw them up my shoulder, right? And jump together, build a ramp. So I feel like, I think in our race conversations, that again, to not just throw everything to white supremacy, although I would say white supremacy, and I hesitate to use the word white also, because in some ways, I've been to the Appalachians, I see the poverty there. It's like, I can't believe it's the 20th century in America that there's no restaurants, no hotels, no public transportation, and they don't even have cars. So how do they live? But anyway, in terms of the supremacy structure that has forced a lot of communities of color to live in poverty, because whether it's the internment, right? The wealth of the Japanese community was taken wholesale. I could give you examples in the Chinese community. I would say even for the Koreans in the LA riots, our wealth that we had built with much sweat and tears was taken away. But again, to this day, instead of being compensated, we're looked upon still as perpetrators as well. So there's, again, different versions of this kind of anti-Asian hate that we're currently experiencing. And I think I would love to spend time later on to go into why Asians are being targets, right? Whether we're looked upon as easy targets or certain narratives that put us into the category of evil that justifies, this type of attack, whatever. But I'm going to also now toss it on to our fellow brother, Samuel.
Yeah, thank you both for doing the heavy lifting. Just adding a few more. So yes, Asians were, hated the first second they laid their, foot on this land. They were called the Yellow Peril. The narrative about them was that they're dangerous. They kept being disease.
Mm-hmm.
There was laws. 15 states had laws against marriage between Chinese and white. As they were mentioning, you think about the Japanese community, 120,000 almost, right? The men, women, and children, all of them taken away from the home, and that's economic, social rape. Just totally generational work just taken away because of one single edict. And of course, all studies after have shown that there was no reason for that order at all. And then Vincent Chin, he was brutally battered by two in the car industry workers who were laid off, blamed the Japanese, saw him as Japanese, right? That's the white supremacy lens, putting us all together as the Yellow Peril, beat him to death, a young man. And for that, they got 3 years of probation and $3,000.
And no jail time.
No, right, probation, no jail time. Right. As one Chinese activist at that time called it, it was a $3,000 license to kill. And if that is the narrative and the court narrative, of course, people would think it's okay to go down the street, kick, punch, beat, kill Asians. They're not going to get anything because Asian lives value is less, insignificant. And the narrative continues, like just while doing this crazy NTI, praises to teachers, I don't know how they do it. 3 kids, but I kind of get to see a little bit of what they're reading. And one of the historical reading that my kid, 10-year-old, was doing was about, why did Europeans start going out exploring? And the Silk Road trade route closed, and that was because of actually a lot of wars, right? But the story that was told to him was Asians were greedy. Oh, and some of the roads began to block because of Asians were greedy. When that story, history was telling about how Europeans went out, some Europeans went out of Christian ideal. Some people, of course, they were greedy. So there was a complexity. But the Asians was simply, they were greedy. And that's what every 10-year-old elementary student will read. Right? That's the narrative today. And I did bring it up to the teachers, thankfully, but if no one brought it up, that is a narrative that will continue on. Anti-Asian hate has always been here.
I also wanted to add in a piece because we're talking a lot about racism and white supremacy and white supremacist policies and acts and in history within the API history, but we're not. But I think 2 things that it would be really important for us to highlight as well is the role of how capitalism has participated in the oppression of Asian Americans and Asians, and then how it's also participated in not just oppressing one racial group, which is the Asian Americans, right? But also our Black kin, also our Latinx kin, also our Indigenous kin, who were the original, right? The Indigenous Americans. Let me give you an example. In the I can never remember dates, 1867, there's a company called the Beaver Falls Cutlery Company, and there was a labor dispute. So all of their workers went on strike to fight for better rights, fight for a better workplace situation for them. And what the company chose to do was replace everybody in the company with 200 Chinese men. I mean, I just want you to think about that for a moment. Chinese men for that company was cheap labor. They felt like because the Chinese were already not being given economic opportunities, so they could replace them with them because they knew they'd be quiet and they would do their job because they don't usually get jobs. And then now you're creating a disparity, you're creating a fight between the working class and Chinese men who are also in the same situation of being oppressed. This is I think this is a really big important part the church often does not talk about, is the role that capitalism actually plays, even within our theology and also in our social experience, is that our bodies, who we are as communities, the reason we're split up as well, the reason we're also being segregated, the reason we're also being put in our place is not just the benefit specifically of just race and racism. It's specifically of, if you will, an economic structure by which we are there to serve somebody else, not ourselves, not God. We're there to fulfill the pleasure and the need of another person, of another power. We're there for profit, for your fetishism, to do your labor in a cheap way, to be quiet and to follow instruction, whatever it might be. And so if you're starting to be a little bit too loud, we're going to replace you with somebody else. That's what we're going to do. And this is the history of these racial tensions that we have throughout the US. This is why there was a Korean Black, fight and tension within South Central LA for so long. Because you have 2 groups of people who are trying to survive, and they're giving crumbs. They're forced into a community, into neighborhoods that are being under-policed and over-policed, if you will. Under-policed in that the police is not there to protect you. The police are there to make sure you stay in your place and don't go into the white folks area. And then you have to survive in this place. And we're just going to throw you crumbs, and you're going to have to somehow survive and figure it out. And when something goes bad and the blacks are acting up or the Koreans are acting up, we're going to blame the other side and say, oh, it's because of the Koreans. Oh, it's because of the black folks over there. That's what's causing the problem. No, what the problem is that you have a system where we've been forced into a neighborhood without that. We have a government system that does not give to everybody. There is no such thing as equity, I'm sorry, in this country right now. And we are just continuing it. And the thing with church, because we are a community of church, of Jesus followers, right? Of Presbyterians here. So let's talk about the church's role. The church has not participated in being who we are called to be, which is to be prophetic in this space. We live in these systems and we continue, and we've just decided to follow it. We've decided to maintain and preserve it, right? I'd love to get more into the theology aspect of it, but I feel like I've done enough of my talking. But I do really think it's important to see how just like that this is not just about API hate. This is not just about hate and discrimination against Asian Americans. This is a constant battle and fight. And so we have to remember when we talk about the fact that Asians and Asian Americans and our Pacific Islander brothers and sisters and kin have been discriminated against from the beginning, we need to remember it's not just us. Yes, our history is often not talked about because we're seen as the model minority where we're quiet and we're good. And so it is important for us to do our study. It is also just as important for us to recognize that this is not about who's got it worse or who's been left out, but the fact that we really need to do this together. Let's also talk about, for example, our poor white brothers and sisters and kin who are also neglected, our transgendered, our bisexual, our lesbian and gay brothers and sisters and kin who are also being left out of the conversation, and our Jewish brothers and sisters, our Muslim brothers and sisters, right? Like we're not talking about how actually intersectional this oppression is. And we need to keep that in mind when we talk about the spaces of hate that we're experiencing.
That's really great. Do you want to say something, Destiny, first?
All I was going to say is that, Rev Ray put the collar on real quick and said, you know what, I got to get a little mini sermon and amen. And I say to all of that. Okay. Hey, Pen, you can go ahead.
I do want to say first that the first Asian came to the United States in the 1500s. So we're not, we could say we're one of the originals per se, but we're still perceived as perpetual, outsiders. I would also say that, again, this concept that we're being greedy, again, I think is a framework. I know that during the LA riots, the media really put the highlight of the store owners and kind of, again, the certain narrative that, again, put us into that category of being greedy, not generous, and, racist and all that. And yet, if you look at the way New York Times depicted the store owners in New York, they were more presented as kind of people who are pursuing the American dream, who kind of overcome all kinds of odds. And so, again, the power structure of how things are framed really is important. And I think going back, in terms of the store owners, the liquor store, I think even that could be potentially political. It could be a neighborhood store. And the fact that too many other stores, bigger stores, have not come into these communities says a lot about the profitability or the lack of profitability and how many of these store owners are risking their life. It is the second most dangerous job as a workplace. Number one is taxi driver. And then number two is these convenience store employees. And so again, the fact that they're there, not again by aspiration, but really of lack of choices, the limited English speaking, the minimum wage, where can they buy, right? So they end up there and they're not wholesale dealers, right? They don't have that. They go to Costco for their products. So how much of a margin could they put, right? And so just a lot of that kind of narrative, I think, is really important that, again, we are able to break down some of these myths to be able to help each other. Going back around, I think, the church narrative, again, it was the U.S. missionaries who actually partnered with the, I think it's the sugar trading, the sugar plantations, right? And so they cut a deal. I think they meant well, to give them a benefit of doubt, but they facilitated in which it was kind of a form of slavery, to tell you the truth, right? And so for someone like Samuel, someone like myself, who never kind of pictured being ahead of, even in the church context, says a lot of kind of how we see ourselves, or the way others have told us how to see ourselves. And then the narrative around being diseased. I learned, again, these are things I'm learning over, and thank God for Facebook. I'm learning a lot because it's not in our history books, right? There was a posting that's in the city of Santa Ana, here in California, that a whole town of Chinatown was totally burned down because supposedly someone had leprosy. And this individual, instead of being treated, he was just starved to death. And I'm just thinking, again, how people see Asians as diseased, greedy, evil, permanent foreigner, are all things that make us easy targets. Because, when I see war movies or refugee movies, they're all tattered. They're almost faceless, right? Personality wise, and so if they're dying off, it's just kind of oh, well, versus the main character, right, that you get to know. And if they die, then suddenly it's oh my gosh. And so in the movie, the narrative of American history, the Asians are the ones that are dispensable, right? We are not the main character. We're not in the picture frame. We are not considered as one who has contributed to this country that has benefited everyone as well. That narrative is never told. And so to be always accused as one way of being racist and us being a perpetual foreigner hurts us. But I think at the end of the day, I've said this, I love the fact living in America, I have access to all kinds of foods from all different, cultures, right? And it's a blessing that each culture was able to shine their space and light on their food. Now, what kind of world could it be? What kind of country could it be? It's not just food, but their culture, their identity, their gifting, that each of them could shine, right? That we will be so much more blessed, right? Instead of being in a competitive mode where, again, whether it's oppression Olympics or it's opportunity Olympics, whatever it may be. So I just want to put that out there.
I want to touch upon some of the things that were raised by both Hailey Pine and Rev Ray. And my assistant means well. I mean, he just brought me a banana. Please understand him. So yeah, I'm glad that you raised that. The narrative of the LA riot was it's the same thing. Asians are greedy, Korean stores are greedy, and they never give back to the community. But that's not true. There are greedy Asians, there are compassionate Asians, right? I mean, we're complex human beings. And then the situation, Rev Ray already talked about it, right? Why we were put into that place. And the tension was created because of the barriers that were put around it. And definitely about the root of it is being capitalism, basically being trying to get free or cheap economic labor. And they will do whatever it takes, right? There's a story about how in Hawaii, the Korean employees or slaves, really, they were beginning to mobilize, and the manager wrote to the owner that the strategy to stop that mobilizing is to bring in Japanese employees because there's a history of animosity between them, and they did. So this was strategic action of bringing two, under-resourced and politically powerless people together, create tension, right? So then they will not be able to mobilize. And so a way out of it is actually, learning how to mobilize, learning how to see that we are stronger together, and that this oppression, right? Anti-Asianness, to fight against anti-Asianness is also to fight against anti-Blackness. To fight against anti-Blackness is to fight against anti-Asianness. And actually, I think in the whole term of Asian America, there is a model for it, right? So it was a political, strategically political empowering label. It was in I think UC Berkeley, it was in the 1968. It was when some Asian students, they saw the Black Power movement and the movement against the Vietnam War, and they realized that we have to come together, because until this Asian American understanding of our shared identity came, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, they didn't see the commonality. So in fact, in the Japanese internment, Korean Americans were bad, saying, "I'm not Japanese, I'm Korean," whereas Chinese Americans, right? But to save their own skin, not realizing that it's really the same system that's going to come for them too. So understanding the Asian Americanness, and I think it began to take popularity. It began to take root in our understanding when Lizin Chin was murdered, and they realized that to whites, like, they don't really care if you're Japanese or Chinese, right? They will murder you because they see us again as a yellow peril. And actually, I think a little bit of theology here, right? Church narrative. I mean, even the word Christian was that, right? It created a new identity where, again, people who didn't see themselves as allies or friends, actually, again, enemies. You know, the Greeks and Jews, we are separated from the history of it. But I mean, you know, Jews and Greeks, they were killing and murdering each other for like centuries. And the word, it's interesting, right? The word Christian began to be used, they say, in Antioch, when actually there were a lot more non-Jewish Christ followers. And they were saying that maybe the word Christian was kind of a slur at them, right? But actually they co-opted it, like, oh, those crazy Christ followers, and said, well, yeah, we are. Kind of like how the queer group took the word queer and made it their own. And they did. And once they saw themselves as a Christian, the shared identity, then the Greeks and Jews, not that those identities was erased, but it was kind of subsumed. You can be a Greek and a Christian, and we could still love each other. Man and woman, right? Paul says there's either no man or woman, master or slave, or in Christ. It doesn't mean that those identities are unimportant, but those identities are not reason for us to fight. And then you have actually Corinthian Christians sending aid to Jewish Christians in Jerusalem when there was a famine. And this was way before any pictures to move the heart. But the empathy was created because they had the shared identity that they were Christians. And I think that's what we need. This is the same battle we're facing.
Yeah, and I wonder about where the church finds itself right now, and where are the spaces to begin to walk alongside our AAPI siblings, but also being aware that we are part of an institution that has created a lot of harm, and we have perpetuated theologies that have created a lot of harm. And so how do we navigate that? And how do we really begin to do the work, as well as holding the institution accountable and holding these theologies accountable as well?
I will also add to that, because we are coming up on the hour. If there's any resources or any places where people could search and learn more, or be in solidarity, to also lift that up as well. And Lee, did you have a particular order on how you wanted to end?
Maybe we'll just go with the spirit this time. Whoever is moved can begin.
Well, I feel moved. So I do want to combat the image that we are quiet. We are human. We've been quiet only because that we have not felt that there was a safe place for us to express our pains. And the times that we have not been quiet, we've been cut out of the picture frame. And so if, as the church who serves as a voice for the voiceless, can be an advocate for the AAPI community to create a safe space where we can share our pain and be acknowledged, and to be an advocate to change policies, I would say that would be a big win for us. I know that when, the Jewish people, Hebrew people, under the rule of, Xerxes and Haman, right, suddenly created this policy where they were now marked as the enemy of the state, right? And they were going to all be killed. It was Esther, who was in position of power and relationship and trust, that was able to advocate for a policy change. She got the meeting and she got the request, right? And so without bloodshed, without money, without whatever, that a whole, a group of people were, their lives were saved and their actually future was enhanced. And so I would say during this COVID-19, as mentioned, that in LA County, Asians had the highest death rate of any group in May of 2020. Asian Pacific Islanders have the highest infection rate. And in cities, as also states, where Asians congregate the most, they have an outsized, harm compared to the overall population. And if you break down, like in New York City, Chinese have the highest death rate, as an example, right? And I think whether it was South Asians and Blacks, they had one of the highest, whether it's hospitalization or infection rate. And also in terms of unemployment, where New York was the epicenter, they had a 10,000% increase in unemployment compared to other groups where there was white and Latino at 3,000. I think African Americans 2,000. And as of even January of this year, Asians at the highest at 500% increase to the next group, which was 300. I'm just giving you some of these numbers that the impact of this COVID-19, not just the anti-Asian racism with the death and assaults and the killing, the stabbing, and all those things, but just economically and health-wise, we have been disproportionately impacted. And yet, even for Susan Rice, who is President Biden's domestic policy in charge of equity, who's supposed to infuse that in all the administration, she says the disproportion of killing of Black, brown lives and completely left out the Asian community. And so again, racism could come out in all kinds of forms, but we as the Asian community, when our pain continues to be erased and left out of initiatives and invitation to those discussion tables, decision-making tables, I think that is what allows the perpetuation of these racism against the Asian community. And so, I call upon the church, right, to be that Esther. You have the relationships, you have the trust, right? And so you have the power to help us to stop this pain, to advocate for stopping this pain, and to allow advocacy to enhance our future here, to live with others. I could go on. I'm giving the other people the spirit to lead.
Yeah, anybody could, Ray? Yeah, Reverend Ray?
Yeah, I was going to see if Samuel wanted to go. I'm still processing what I wanted to share. Yeah, Samuel, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So one thing is that we need all of our Christian siblings to actually challenge the simplistic narrative that they are bombarded with, right? Even just recently, Rolling Stone came out with how the main media covered the Asian American shooting and how the Korean newspapers and other Asian papers, and where the main media still focuses on, right, what the shooter said. That's still the driving narrative framework, right? So let's just be honest. Like, we are continually bombarded with, again, anti-Asian narrative. So it's important, and all of our scripture will be interpreted through that. So it's important that we read, and we'll send some resources like the Making of Asian American story, listening to your Asian American leaders and theologians. That's so important. I think secondly, it is also, Rev Ray talked about the economic root of all this. The church has to look at, like, what is your employment practice too? Which could be, again, who do you employ as your staff, and according to what race, look at the different levels of your salary and who's there. You really have to do inside, honest look. And also then look at, like, what policies do we not protest against? There's some regional, local laws that creates, again, those ghettos, right? That limits resources and economic possibilities of people. You have to do this hard work. I don't want the church just to think that I've signed my name. I went out there. I did stop AAPI hate. Now I know everything there is. No, you don't. The default operating system, again, is anti-Asian hate. To blame them whenever issues come up, crises come up, blame them. Throw the Japanese into the camp, right? Exclude the Chinese, right? It's the Koreans, right? And those greedy store owners. Like about a couple of weeks ago, I was walking my dog, and my assistant, he's always joining me in the morning. And as I told him about the shooting, he said to me, why do they hate us? What did we do wrong? I don't want him to ask that question. No, we didn't do anything wrong. He should not be asking that question.
Thanks, Samuel. I totally agree with Samuel and Hailey and what they shared. I think the way that I want to answer this question, I know I have like 2 minutes left. I feel like we could go for another hour here. Is that I think that we as a church we've not been honest in our participation in maintaining this sort of racist, white supremacist, capitalist, plantation capitalism, style of society. I mean, we need to take ownership of the fact that the shooting in Atlanta was done by a Christian man who talked about his Christian beliefs and wrestled with his sexuality, and blamed a group of people, or specifically women, but then we know specifically Asian women in this circumstance, and the interlayering of the fact that this is violence against Asian peoples, or the way that they've been targeted, and the fetishism of Asian women's bodies as sexualized creatures, and then the role that the church has played in saying you have to be this and you have to do this. We're not talking about that. We need to be talking about that in the church. We need to actually be asking these questions. We are part. He came from an evangelical church. Many of our Presbyterian churches are evangelical. I am an evangelical person. I come from that tradition, right? So, I mean, this is part of our theology. Our theology is embedded and came out and grew out of one that was white European, male-dominated understanding of reading of the Bible, of now our interpretation of the Bible. And yet the person we follow is a brown man from the Middle East who is Jewish, from a Jewish family, right? Like, we're not, so I know it's 4, so like I need to stop. So I just want to name the fact that we're not wrestling and being honest about the questions that we need to be wrestling with in our church. We're not digging deep into our theology and saying, hey, what was from the get-go, the way that we're reading this, not actually, that it's actually problematic. It's actually problematic and rooted in a racist system, right? And even within our Bible, be wrestling with the fact that there's ways that are talked about men and women and slavery and things. I mean, we need to be talking about that. You know what I mean? I promise. I gotta just say this to our Asian brothers and sisters. We also have our own stuff that we gotta deal with. We have anti-Blackness and racism in our own communities. Sam already brought it up, and the fact that we oftentimes other people already, even in our community, we're like, well, those Chinese versus those Japanese versus those Koreans versus those Filipinos versus those, like, we already do that. And then there is a definite anti-Blackness within our community, within the culture of our community. And that comes out, and that is played out, and that is taught, and that is embedded within our culture. And we isolate ourselves, and we feel disempowered, and we need to realize and recognize how powerful we are. There are so many instances in history in the United States by which we went on strike and said no, and we won, and we've forgotten that history. We've forgotten that history in part because many of us are new to this country because of the exclusionary acts that were in place. And so we never learned that history, and we don't know that history. So now we got to live it. And now we got to really embrace and join in that it's not just about us, but it's really all together. And so that's my last word. It's 4:02. I apologize I went on, but there's just so much more to say. We have only, I feel like, just dipped into the shallow waters and talking about the church's role and the problems that we bring, but also the fact that God is with us and the fact that God has created us. And so there is not just hope, there is resurrection, right? It's Easter time. There is resurrection because this was not as God intended, and God is with us and guiding us, and we just need to follow the Spirit. And in this moment, we just got to do that.
Thank you. Could I share a resource and at least a mini little success story?
Yeah, we started late. It's totally fine. We have a little bit of time left.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rev Ray, as well, Samuel, for sharing. I do want to say, in terms of on our website at facela.org, we have a data point, PowerPoint, that shows the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the Asian community with all the references. In addition, we also wrote an article called The Biden Presidency and the Continued Omission of Asian Americans. Again, even that, it's not really just about Biden presidency, but really more of Asians missing and being omitted in the national conversation and initiatives. And then finally, in terms of a success, so I noticed that Susan Rice, as mentioned, had left the Asian community out. And so we were advocating to the White House to make sure that whenever they mention that they would include the AAPI community. And after my press conference with Vice President Kamala Harris, there was another meeting where President Biden came. And he was sharing about the COVID-19 initiative. And he said, Black, brown. And then he said, Asian American. Well, actually, he said Asian Pacific Islander. So that was a major victory. But just kind of how awkward that was for him because he was not used to it. He started off saying Asian American, and he kind of paused because he knew there was more to it, but I think he wasn't sure what the official, and then he went AAPI, and then he finally said Asian Pacific Islander. So again, I think there is hope, and I think that as believers, there is always a resurrection that comes forth from pain and death. And so I think even in this moment of history that we're even having even this opportunity to talk about the AAPI community and our history and our desire to be full participants of the society as believers, as fellow Asian Americans, I think is something that is hopeful. And so I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, and thank y'all for doing this. We're actually going to have a part 2 to this, which will happen in May. And so you may be getting another email. There are others who will be joining this. Irene Cho is going to be joining, but I would love for all of you to be there to continue this conversation because, again, we did not even break the surface of all the things that we need to be talking about. But again, this is the whole point of this show is to start these conversations, but we have to do more than just a show like this. And so we really point you to the comments where all the resources that were mentioned have been posted. And if you have any questions or comments, just feel free to leave those in the comments and we'll try to get back to you with those. But again, thank you so much for being here and for the work that y'all do. We are so blessed to be in your presence and in this space with you. And we'll hope you'll come back for the next time.
I definitely, I know we can't hear more today, but I want to hear more about your call stories, Hailey Pine and Rev Ray. I know just having a lot of Korean friends and who are women, particularly in the church, their ordination process has not been easy. And I think that's something that I would like to hear more about and share widely on the show. So,
love to do
thank you, Samuelson, for the connections. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is great.
Yeah, thank y'all so much. And audience out there, check out the resources, the websites, and we will always be here on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So yeah, thank y'all again. And until next week, we'll see you all then.
God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.